So it's really important to know and be familiar with the state and federal laws. And again, you don't have to be an expert in them. It's making sure that you have the systems in place to support you so that you are abiding by the laws and you do have an expert within your organization that does specialize in that, such as HR. I want to share a little bit about my story with hiring associates and employees in general. I've been a supervisor for over 12 years. And that includes supervising before I actually had my clinical license. I was a manager. And so I've had years and years of practice hiring people. And I want to share some of my own mistakes that I've made along the way. The first one is absolutely not going with my gut on the hire. The interview can tell you a whole lot about what you need to know about the clinician. And for me, it's not about the clinical skills, it's about the personality and the vibe that I get. As we get into the training, I'll share more about that and my process. Some people might not agree. I definitely have different practices than I think other people do because I have learned to go more with my intuition versus assessing someone's clinical skills. So the goal of today is to show you a little bit how to navigate the legal framework of hiring people, how to find candidates or associates, and then how to integrate them into your nonprofit. Let's start with understanding the legal framework. I'm guessing that this is probably the one thing that most people worry about when hiring, and you should because you are hiring employees. In most states, it is a requirement, if not all states now, because of the IRS regulations for hiring contractors. But if not in all states, an associate has to be an employee of the nonprofit, which means they have to be a W-2 employee. So there's lots of laws, federal and state, that you should know. Not that you have to be an expert in them. You don't have to be an expert to run a nonprofit in every single thing. That's impossible. But to know your strengths and weaknesses and to bring in the people that do have the expertise in that. So you don't have to be an expert in HR, but you do have to have some sort of HR process in as part of your system. So some of the laws that you should know are the Fair Labor Standards Act and American Disabilities Act, and how to navigate those in practice. So if someone discloses to you a disability, it could be mental health or physical, that's something that you have to follow up on as a manager or supervisor. So it's really important to know and be familiar with the state and federal laws. And again, you don't have to be an expert in them. It's making sure that you have the systems in place to support you so that you are abiding by the laws and you do have an expert within your organization that does specialize in that, such as HR. It doesn't have to be a full on department. And a lot of payroll systems these days include HR services that you can pay for as part of your plan. That's what I do. I use a payroll system called Gusto, and I pay for the premium plan that has 24/7 support for HR. Okay, let's talk about contracting or what that looks like in bringing someone on. So when you start to have these conversations, again, we're going to go with that you are not actually doing a physical 1099 contract, that you are doing a W-2 employment agreement type of contract. That is the best route to do with associates because they're not acting independently, and so they really don't qualify for a 1099. But as you explore this option, you want to make sure that you have the details worked out of what the compensation is and what the benefits are that you're going to offer. Any conditions for termination, you're going to want to have that all planned out and your policies and procedures in place. Comp, uh, Compensation really needs to be in certain states, you have to post it. In fact, that might be in all states now, but it used to be that you didn't have to post when you were advertising what the compensation is. You have to do that now. I know in California that's absolutely a requirement. So people need to know what they're going to be paid hourly for coming onto your agency. Typically, it is an hourly rate. When you start getting into salaried type stuff, that's a whole other level. And there's lots of pros and cons to that once you get larger, something that I'll dive into maybe in another training. But Typically, you're going to start them off fee for service, and their hourly rate is going to be a flat hourly rate. So, as an associate, you're not doing a percentage of the reimbursement. So, in your contract, you can't say, as a W-2 employee, you're getting, X percentage of the reimbursement rate. You can't do that for associates. That's illegal. You can do that for 1099 contractors, licensed clinicians, but for associates, you have to have a flat hourly rate that they get regardless of the reimbursement rate for the session. So that's something you're going to want to calculate on your end. If you have multiple funding streams with different reimbursement rates, you're going to want to figure out, okay, what's the average in terms of which reimbursement rate is seen the most, and how are we going to average out what we can reasonably pay the associate while also factoring in, if you or someone else in the agency is providing supervision, your supervision rate, and how many sessions they would have to have minimum per week for you to be able to pay your supervision rate, which is like 1 to 2 hours of supervision a week, right? So all of that is going to be factored into their hourly rate. I pay associates $40 an hour, um, or per face-to-face session, and within that time frame they're expected to get their notes done. We'll talk about notes, that's like a whole other level. But yeah, so you're going to want to know what the compensation is, what any benefits are that you offer. um, if you do have full-time associates, which is, I believe the regulation is 30 or more hours a week, then you, at least in California, you have to offer sick time. You may not be able to offer PTO or vacation or health insurance benefits, which is okay. But you do have to offer sick time. Right now, I don't have any full-time associates. They work, I mean, what I consider actually full-time caseload is like 20 to 25 clients a week, but per employment standards, 30 plus hours a week is really what's considered full-time. Okay, so that's the contracting and kind of the legal stuff. Let's dive into defining the actual role and expectation. I've had to learn this the hard way. I in the past have been pretty flexible and open and not really concrete and definitive in what expectations or and roles are, and that has come back to bite me. It is very important that you are laying a clear foundation up front of what your expectations are for your nonprofit. I do all of this in the interview process so that it's very clear. I reinforce it in onboarding, and I give specific days and timelines that things are due and expected to be done. This is so it's clear. And you're going to have an easier time if someone is not following those standards to terminate, if the expectations were clear from the beginning versus if they were vague and nothing's in writing. So you're going to want to outline specifically what the duties include for an associate for your nonprofit. So you're going to want to have a job description that outlines all of that. For me, there's certain things that are just non-negotiables in terms of expectation. One is that notes are done by the end of the week, at the very, very latest. Number one, I cannot bill until notes are done. Number two, I think it's a big problem if you're waiting weeks and weeks to write your note, because then you're not accurately capturing what was in that session. I know that's true for me. I mean, I could, within 24 hours, I could not remember exactly what happened in that session. So, especially if you're seeing a lot of clients, I feel like it's an ethical thing and standard to set to have your notes done minimum by the end of the week. I know a lot of people put on the expectation is 24 hours and 48 hours, and that might be best practice, but we all know that's not always realistic and reasonable. So I feel like for me, a happy medium is by the end of the week, all of my clinicians know I'm billing on Sunday and all notes need to be done. That is absolutely an expectation. Another expectation for me is really a lot of communication. I would rather have more communication than no communication. So I want to know, okay, if I sent you a referral, I want to know when you called them and what the outcome was as soon as possible. I want to know if you've had multiple no-shows that week or whatever the situation is. I want to know. I don't want to be kept in the dark so that I can guide. So I tell clinicians that I would rather them overly communicate than under communicate with me. All right, so in terms of roles and expectations, it's also important to think about skills and qualifications. This is where some people might disagree with me. At the end of the day, depending on what state you're in and what regulating bodies you're licensed with, you have to follow those. So, for example, in Pennsylvania, if you are a licensed outpatient mental health agency with the state, licensed with the state, not, I'm not talking like I'm an LMFT and I'm licensed with the State Board of Pennsylvania. That's not what I mean. What I mean is my agency, if I were a nonprofit agency licensed with the state of California to provide mental health outpatient services, I would also have to abide by all of their regulations, which may be different than like federal or other regulations. So, for example, in Pennsylvania, if you're licensed with the state, then there's certain criteria that clinicians need to meet in order to be an associate or even a practicum student. And that may not be the case if you're not licensed. So that could be, I think, like you have to have a certain practicum and you have to have certain credits on your transcript. And you also have to, I believe, I can't remember all of them, but you have to have like a bachelor's in psychology. Whereas if you're not licensed with the state, which I am not licensed with the state of Pennsylvania, I don't want to be, you don't have to be, um, I can then hire someone who has a master's in counseling that maybe doesn't have the specific practicum requirements that if you were licensed with the state did, and maybe they have a bachelor's in like communications or something. So you have to know all of the different regulating bodies. It's not just as simple as the employment laws. It depends on all of the other licensing that you have. So, aside from that, when it comes to skills and qualifications, if you're matching up them with all of the different regulating bodies, for me, it comes down to how are you actually interacting interpersonally in an interview? What are the basics? If those basics are not being met, those are red flags for me, and I'm probably not moving forward with hiring. So, for me, it's not so much about skill set unless I get some major red flags about skill set. For me, it's more about can I work with this person? Is this person open to feedback? Does this person really want to learn how to be a clinician? So, in all honesty, I would rather hire clinicians or associates that are super green than maybe ones who've been in the field for a long time and have learned some really bad habits. Not that I think that can't be reshaped, but just in my experience, I don't have any problems with hiring someone who is super green and doesn't have a whole lot of experience or a whole repertoire of clinical skills. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the recruitment process. I think I mentioned this already, but when you're posting, like whether you're recruiting in Facebook groups, which you can absolutely do, or you're using something like Indeed or word of mouth or whatever, it is really important to be transparent about what you pay them and what the compensation is. Not only is that a legal practice, but it's also best practice. It shows the associate that you are transparent about how your practice runs. For me, I explain how I came up with that rate and why they're getting paid what they get paid. I think it's really important to provide transparency when it comes to compensation. For interviewing, you can have a set question of interviews, a set like Word doc of interview questions. For me, that's again not so much important. But I did follow that for a number of years, and I think at this point I've just kind of memorized it. So for me, I might be asking those clinical questions, but I'm more assessing um, their interpersonal style and if they're open to feedback. One thing I absolutely feel like is really important is that the associate, if they don't have the skills, but they're open to learning how to assess for suicide and homicide, that is something that I have found time and time again is not focused on and should be for safety and liability, especially if they're going to be working under your license. Okay, the last thing under here is background checks. This is really important, especially if any of your associates are going to be working with kids or adolescents. And this can be done through the HR payroll system. I have it set up automatically that it has to be done, so it's pretty easy and actually not too expensive. All right, so onboarding and training. Please, please do not underestimate this. It is very, very important to have a training outline for your associates. They need to know what to expect once they start working with you. There is research behind people quitting within 30 days because their onboarding and training was not adequate. So I can't stress this enough. It's really important to have standard operating procedures, policies and procedures, and a training guide for your associates. You want them to know exactly how to work things and be able to train them in a way where they're all getting the same training across the board and you're covering specific topics. I have this in my course. I have a supervision and hiring workshop, and this is one of the things I'm really passionate about is developing an onboarding training manual so that you have a checklist that you're reviewing with every associate that comes on board with you, so that number one, they can't come back and say they never heard you say that, which happens all the time, and also so that you can ensure you're not missing anything when you're training them. The last part that I feel like is really important is how are you going to welcome them into your agency? What is the culture and tone that you want to set? For me, it's really important that we have integrity and passion and professionalism, but also for us, it's more kind of a casual nature. I'm not like the type of supervisor that's like, oh, you have to be business professional all the time with what you're wearing. That's just not the way I practice, but it is really important to me that we are presenting professionally. We're showing up on time. We're following through with what we said we're going to do, and we lead with integrity. Those things are really, really important for me. So all of that is part of how I orient new associates to my nonprofit, and on other teams that I've worked for.